Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
Coming how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Before we get into this episode of the Karma Koala podcast, I just wanted to let you know that this podcast episode contains discussions of sexual abuse and may include detailed descriptions of traumatic experiences. If you or someone you know has been affected by sexual abuse, please be aware that listening to this content may be distressing. We do encourage you to prioritize your well-being and seek support if needed. Hi, welcome back. Another episode of the Karma Koala podcast. We're going a little off topic in this episode, but not really. I'm sort of developing the psychedelics episodes. As anybody who's been listening will know that I've been speaking to some lawyers, and I was contacted in the last few weeks by Chuck Lovett from the US, who is a survivor of sexual abuse from the Catholic Church way back in the early 70s. And as we discussed in the preamble, that's not unusual for that period, not just in the US. So it was a very big issue in Australia, and also in terms of the UK, where I come from, not so much in the Church of England, but definitely in the private education sector. It's been a huge issue. So, Chuck, I'd love to welcome you to the Karma Koala podcast. And accompanying Chuck is Nitai, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. Tell me if I haven't. Nitai Aleksiewicz. She is a licensed psilocybin facilitator from Oregon, who are some of the brightest people, I have to say, that I ever speak to. Amazing people. I think people have an idea of licensed psilocybin facilitators as sort of a bit sort of in the air and all over the place. But every time I speak to somebody, it's like speaking to somebody who studied classics at Oxford or Cambridge in the 1930s. As I had a grandmother who did that, I know what I'm saying there. The intellectual stricture to which these practices have to adhere to is fantastic in Oregon, and it really is attracting some of the best people, I think. Thank you for both of you for being on the Karma Koala podcast. Chuck, maybe we'd start with you, and
yes,
maybe talk a little bit about your experience. It's something that I imagine a number of listeners are going to sort of to understand very closely, not just, as I said, in the US, but in different parts of the world. Anywhere there's a power structure, whether it be religious, educational, or a range of other areas, these things happen, but we're only finding out 50 years later to the extent to which it happened in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. And I think it's fantastic that you're brave enough to come on and talk about it. My brother recently, in the past couple of years, actually went and testified in court in the UK because a friend of his had committed suicide after abuse at the school that we all went to. So this is sort of, in a way, quite a personal thing for me to speak about as well. But thank you very much for sort of standing up and talking about it. And then, we can discuss how psilocybin and other psychedelic compounds may be a way to help manage some of this trauma.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today, Sean. Like you said, in the early 1970s, after CCD class one Sunday, a group of us from St. Rosalama Church in Altoona, PA, where I grew up, we were invited to go up to the St. Francis Rectory of the Altoona Johnstown Diocese to spend the afternoon with the priest up there, see what seminary life was like, to see if we possibly wanted to become priests later in our lives. And part of the day's agenda that Sunday was there was a pool in the seminary, and we swam. Got to swim with the priest.
We had that at school. We were up at 5 a.m. naked swimming throughout the summer. So it's a pretty
So,
standard thing.
as you can imagine, then you're in the locker room with the priest changing, and that's when my sexual abuse took place in that locker room.
At the time, you're young, you don't really did you realize that there was trauma in your life throughout your 20s and 30s, or was this something that really started to kick in your 40s and 50s?
Yeah, a long life of self-medication and having trouble with anger issues. One point in my career, my employer mandated that I go to anger management counseling to keep my job. So it's affected my life in many various ways, which I really didn't start to seriously examine and look at until my mid 50s.
And so you hadn't really sought any sort of
Off and on
psychiatric
over the
treatment
years, I've
or
gone to therapy, but never, it was always stop, start, and times in between not really taking it seriously, then struggling with life.
And what about
And then
school friends that you grew up with? I presume some had the same experience, some were on the edge of that experience. Did you ever
yes,
manage to discuss that until an older age? Because again, it's the same issue. These conversations really never came up until our late 40s, I don't think.
yeah. Yeah, it's some of my closest friends I grew up with, some of my college mates I told about. I never told my parents what happened.
We would actually tell our parents and they wouldn't believe us until eventually one went to prison in their 70s and very shocked because, of course, he was the favorite and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, it's a difficult conversation, especially with parents, because they tend not, in at that stage, they just tended to think that people in authority, especially teachers, were they couldn't imagine the possibility of them acting in that way.
Boston Globe, the spotlight was so eye-opening to the whole world, what was going on in the church all those years.
And as I said, yeah, in Australia, the story is exactly the same. And, I presume you followed the Cardinal Pell, who was, the right-hand man to the last Pope. But, he essentially shut down all the inquiries in Australia for 30, 40 years. They eventually put him away, but he was out again within months. The power of the
The stories about them just switching the priest from parish to parish to hide them after attention was brought to what they were doing to these young men and stuff. It's just a very sad situation, and so ugly that the church allowed it to happen and allowed it to continue to happen all those years. In 2016, I live in the state of Pennsylvania. The Attorney General's office here was doing an investigation, and I saw it on the news, and they were asking for people to reach out and to them and report your abuse. I did that at that time in 2016, and they directed me to report my abuse directly to the diocese where it took place in Altoona, Johnstown, and I did that at that time as well. Every diocese in the United States has a position which is called the Victims Assistance Coordinator. I'm not sure if you knew of that, but that's every parish or every diocese has that in the United States, and that's to help victims of sexual abuse within the church. So I reached out to a woman named Jean Johnstone. She's still to this day the director or victims assistance director for the Altoona Johnstown Diocese, and told her my story in vivid detail. I told her about remembering the exact how the benches were attached to the ground in the locker room, the brick in the locker room, the skylights in the locker room. And a little time after I did that, I got a letter in the mail saying that the Altoona Johnstown Diocese was providing me some compensation funds for mental health therapy, which at that time I sat on that letter for a while, didn't take advantage of those funds, reached out to her again, and did take advantage of those funds for some EMDR treatments. Forget the exact time that took place. Did that, and had some health issues in 2022 till I had like 6 surgeries within 17 months, and I was off work for quite a bit of time. And I started researching and reading about psilocybin for mental health therapy, investigating it personally myself. April of 2023, or I had my shoulder replaced, and it was a workers' compensation injury from my work. You get to talk. You talk to a nurse case manager, and this woman sent me down a dark hole with how she treated me and what she spoke to me about, saying that after my initial letter from the doctor was I was going to be off 8 weeks after that surgery, and 4 weeks after that, she said to me, between you, me, and the four walls, your employer is asking why you can't come back to work at a limited fashion. And I've worked for my employer for over 30 years. So that just sent me down a dark hole to think, giving 30 years of my life to that employer. But that's just the games. I wasn't aware of it at the time. I had never spoken to a workers' comp lawyer or anything like that. That's just the game the insurance companies play. And it's no wonder we have people like Luigi Mangione running around shooting people and killing people. And that's how the insurance companies act and treat human beings. It's just very disgusting and disturbing. Sad to say that my reaction was I wanted to get a gun and go into work and off hours and blow my brains out and just let them find me there. So I knew I needed help. I was sick of living like that all these years. So I reached out to Gene again and asked if the funds were available, what funds I had. And I started using talk therapy, using the funds for that. The psilocybin therapy, mental health therapy was just there for me. And it's something I wanted to do for myself, but it wasn't a church approved mental health therapy. So I had to, at one point you were allowed, if you want to, and I took advantage of this, I asked to meet and sit down with the current bishop of the diocese where the abuse took place. So in June of 2023, I met with Bishop Mark Barchak in his private residence at the Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament in Altoona, Pennsylvania. At that time, I asked him, I think it would be a nice thing. I explained to him I've been researching about psilocybin mental health, and I said I think it would be a nice thing for the church to fund a research study at Johns Hopkins for the victims of sexual abuse within the church to see if psilocybin could help them. And he said that the church didn't have that money, so he did ask that I'd send him and Gene some information that I had gathered about psilocybin mental health sessions and therapy. And so I started sending them stuff. And then I just thought, I wanted this for myself, and it wasn't an approved therapy. They send you a list of therapists in the area that you could use these funds for. So I just was at the end of my rope, and
Nitai, you'd like to come in now and explain how difficult it is for people outside the state of Oregon, essentially, to be able to get proper information about psilocybin treatment, because there's just so much misinformation out there, and how that's managed in every other state in the US, where it's essentially non-compliant. There's lots of politicians talking about doing something, but nothing very much happens, and the level of information is extremely low.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. What I would like to point to is that, there's sort of the misinformation from the past, especially from a certain generation, which is the idea that you take psychedelics and you may jump out of a building, or you'll go somewhere and never come back, right? There are these sort of extremist things that are oftentimes attached to the DARE campaign, right? This idea of, I'm going to scare you out of accessing this. And then, more recently, what I would say is there's a misrepresentation of actually psilocybin in the other direction, which is, this is going to be a magic fix.
Yeah, it's a magic cure-all pill. It's all easy. Just pop it and you'll be off.
And what I am very passionate about speaking to is the fact that we have, in our sort of medical paradigm, created this idea that I'm going to hand you a pill to make you better, which is for the most part covering up or slapping a Band-Aid on the symptoms, and not actually speaking to, the deeper, longer, harder, but more sustainable, practices of healing and becoming healthy. And so for me, I see this sort of appropriation of psilocybin therapy as becoming kind of boxed or shaped to fit into that paradigm, which it actually, doesn't. It's an
Well, every
ancient.
time we have a discussion about psychedelics, this is when I talk about law, because they love boxes in law. And this is why psychedelics lawyers are really interesting, because they've got to work within boxes, but they understand that once you start talking about these compounds, the boxes tend to dissolve, and it's very difficult to place things in the existing paradigm. And this is why it's a really interesting conversation, because we're talking about professions, medical professions, legal professions, and a whole range of other professions which will at some point have to engage with these compounds. I just find it a really interesting topic to understand how we manage, because we still have to sort of create some sort of box in there, and that's what Oregon seems to be doing quite well at the moment, is treading that fine line between a a fairly sophisticated professional approach and management of therapy, but at the same time, leaving time for intellectual curiosity.
Well, it's really nice to hear that reflection. I think when you're in it, you're probably the most critical.
Yeah.
But I will say that what I am passionate about establishing, even within the framework of Oregon, which by the way is not a medical model, it's actually, the claim is actually we're going to create a legal experience and whatever, and we're going to hold certain standards of safety and accountability, which I actually find to be too minimal in terms of creating clarity with clients coming in that this is part of a longer transformational journey. And oftentimes, psilocybin therapy can open the door to a deeper wound or experience from the subconscious. So the idea is to really put it into perspective and to actually create higher standards of trauma-informed practices and preparation, and to really be clear that anyone coming in to experience this, it is their mental health. And to me, somebody's life and somebody's mental health are hand in hand. I'll now segue this back into Chuck and my first experience with him, which was I was actually doing the initial vetting call, the initial exploration call for a retreat company that I was working for in Ashland at the time. And I took the call because I have a background where I was trained to do crisis counseling for, adult survivors of sexual abuse and also for survivors of sexual assault. And so I was given the call as a way of saying, hey, like, you have more expertise in this area, please suss this
Have
out.
this
And
conversation. Yeah.
what I might say is my relationship with Chuck began there, and he was a not yet. So he was a no. And the reason why that was because there wasn't enough of a consistent or regular ongoing support. And as a facilitator, my concern is if the Band-Aid is ripped off and you leave me, what environment are you going back to? And how can I look at every aspect of it? How valued do you feel in your professional career? What your personal support system is? What your professional support system is? And basically, I had a conversation where I said, listen, I think that what would be super helpful is if we could establish more consistent professional support in this network and support specifically geared for adult survivors. And can I tell you, and I will say this again and again, I have never met anyone with more commitment and tenacity than this man right here. And so what started was 2 months of every other day to every day a new, hey, I've researched this, I've checked out this, I'm looking into this, I'm seeing if this is possible, I'm seeing if this support is possible, I'm seeing if this, and it was so consistent and so committed. And when the conversation was had between me and the other retreat company where I was like, hey, I'm building personalized long runway retreats for people that might be served with doing a really well-held container but like an immersive program with significant support before, significant support after, and like a 5-day immersive program in the middle. The person I was working with said, "Hey, I think you've had all this interaction with Chuck. You understand this better. Like, let me go ahead and see if this is actually the better program," which is also high in ethical integrity, right? That's collaboration, not competition. So at this point in time, and maybe I'll pass this back to Chuck here in a minute, he actually had been so committed to this process that a monthly group for male survivors of child abuse was formed because of his interest and because of his sort of persistence. And by the time, we started planning this retreat, we were a few months deep in this commitment, in this conversation. And that is when the not yet became a yes.
So,
Yeah, we
I mean,
first
essentially, an
spoke with each other.
old-fashioned conversation and a little bit of time and trust between individuals is really what built you to have the confidence to say, I can try this.
Yeah, the program that Nitai laid out, she had certain benchmarks I had to meet. There was no way I was going to be able to come out to Oregon and take part in that program unless I met them. I had to have a safety net here at home when I returned from Oregon after the psilocybin therapy sessions in place. Like Nitai said, I was reaching out trying to find a support group for victims of male sexual abuse where I live here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and there was none around. The closest was like Philadelphia. And then I reached out to an organization which had one for women, and the director of that organization said they were thinking about getting one started, and it took like a couple months, and she reached back to me and said they were ready to start it. I was the inaugural member, me and another gentleman in that group, and I've been going to his monthly sessions regularly since May of last year.
So, I mean, essentially, because of the way that the law exists, or there's no law, there's no regulation, everything is upon you to create the environment in order to be able to feel confident enough to be using this therapy in a legal manner. You physically have to fly to Oregon to do that.
Yes,
That's
as I
correct,
mentioned,
Nitai?
this was not on the Altoona Johnstown Diocese list of approved mental health therapies. So I had to fight them for that. They wanted a Pennsylvania licensed therapist to sign off on that trip out to Oregon. And the woman I was working with for quite some time, she didn't know enough about it to be able to comfortably do that for me, which I had no problem with. I understood her point of view. It was all her profession if something bad went awry, and she was the one that said that, gave me the permission to go out there. So I had to fight the church and tell them, I did not choose to be a victim of sexual abuse within their walls back in the early 1970s. But I choose to go out to Oregon to heal from that experience. And I wanted to go out and experience those psilocybin mental health sessions. And I finally convinced them after a strongly worded email to Gene that, I was going to pay for it myself if they didn't allow me to use the funds that they provided me for mental health therapy. And then I was going to sue them to get that money from them. So they allowed me to go out there after I said that I, was going to do that. I'm so happy that I made that trip out to Oregon. I cannot tell you how much it's changed
you've
my
now
life.
developed a relationship that I presume, one trip isn't going to, sorry, excuse the pun, isn't going to make the changes. So how, we haven't got long to run. How do you manage on, a limited budget, having to go to work, to get the therapy that you need and the professional help you need when you have to fly across the country back and forth on your own funds? And look, this isn't unusual. The early days of medical cannabis, and medical cannabis is still like this in the UK, or a lot of the cases in Australia and other places still, is there's no support from the government or from other organizations. How do you work that, and how do you persuade other people who are in a similar position to you that the costs, the benefits of the costs are worthwhile to them.
It's just made such a tremendous, what I experienced in Oregon has made such a tremendous difference in my life. A lifelong friend that I've known for like 45 years. We met with each other like 6 weeks after I came back from Oregon, and I was out in the yard working as he came into my apartment, and he just said, as soon as I saw you, I could tell you were a changed person. And I had a couple experiences like that. When I returned back from Oregon, my aunt and uncle picked me up at the Pittsburgh airport where I flew out of to go out to Oregon. And I stood at the curb. My uncle said to me, call me when you're done baggage claim. You're getting ready to stand outside. And Pittsburgh's not a real busy airport. I arrived at like 11 o'clock at night. So I stood at the entranceway where you pick up the passengers right next to the a police car that had their lights flashing and waiting. And he calls me and he says, are you waiting outside? I said, yeah, I'm right by the cop car with the lights on. He said, we drove by there and looked, and we didn't see you. And I explained this story to Nitai after I got home, and she said that I had shifted. I was a different person than when I went out to Oregon when I came back, and they were looking for the old me. And I had 3 separate experiences similar to that people, another person at work, I told him I was going to do this. He's a close friend. The first day I came back to work after those sessions, he goes, you look so much more calmer. But I mean, the way I react, especially when you experience sexual abuse at a young age, when you have a still developing brain, it seals off a part of your mind. And that's how I reacted with anger, trust issues, and my personal relationships throughout my life. I explained about, my anger management mandatory to keep my job. I'm not that person anymore. The psilocybin therapy has helped heal my brain, and it's not a magic bullet. I go to this monthly support group sessions. I have monthly therapist sessions.
Yes, well, I mean, look, I would love to carry on talking, but I'm down to 5 minutes already. And I just wanted to raise that point about, it's not a magic bullet, because for somebody like me who hasn't been through a official sort of setup, I find that the effects of psychedelics actually only really take place 20 years later, when you haven't used them for 15 years. The power of them is that strong. It's and that's why I'm really interested in talking about these issues. I'm really interested in talking to people like Nitai, because they're like the astronauts. Well, they love that word psychonauts in underground sort of media, but they are literally the astronauts of professions, to really not understand that psychedelics don't need to be boxed, but they do need to be managed. And I'd love to have you both guys back for another episode to talk about how we manage the use of psychedelics in therapy, so that we don't experience the same power issues that you experienced back in the early 1970s, because there are inklings of that already. And I think it's really important to knock that on the head as soon as possible. And look, Nitai, I've only got literally 4 minutes left, but I'd love you just to say a quick word about that before we go. And if I could invite you both back at a later date to talk about both of your thoughts as a therapy provider and a therapy user on how we can best develop structures to make this really work for people.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And I'll make this as succinct as